It was a cold evening in January when the video first appeared online. Someone had filmed it on their phone, the footage shaky and slightly blurred, the sound echoing off the high ceilings of a busy train station somewhere in Eastern Europe. At first glance, there was nothing special about it. Just another clip lost in the endless scroll of the internet. But within hours, something changed. People started sharing it. Then they shared it again. By morning, millions had watched it. And everyone was asking the same question. Who was the man at the piano? The video began simply enough. A public piano sat in the corner of the station, one of those instruments placed in open spaces for anyone to play. Most of the time, passers-by would tap out a few notes for fun, maybe attempt a clumsy tune before moving on. But this time was different. A man approached the piano slowly. He wore a long coat that had seen better days, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His shoes were scuffed and muddy. His hair was gray and uncombed, falling across his forehead in messy strands. He looked like someone the world had forgotten. He sat down on the bench without looking around. For a moment, he just stared at the keys, his hands resting in his lap. The station buzzed with noise. Announcements crackled over the speakers. People rushed past, dragging suitcases, checking their phones, barely noticing the old man sitting there. Then he lifted his hands, and he began to play. The first notes cut through the noise like a blade. It was a piece by Chopin, one of the most difficult compositions ever written for piano. The kind of music that takes years to master, the kind that concert pianists spend their entire careers perfecting. But this man played it as if it were nothing. His fingers moved across the keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. The melody rose and fell, soft and powerful, filling the station with a sound so beautiful that people stopped in their tracks. A woman pulling a suitcase paused mid-step, her mouth slightly open. A group of teenagers stopped talking and turned to stare. A businessman lowered his phone and just watched. One by one, the crowd gathered around the piano, forming a half-circle of silent listeners. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stood there, caught in the spell of the music. The person filming the video zoomed in on the man's face. His eyes were closed, his expression calm, almost peaceful. He swayed gently with the rhythm, lost in the world he was creating. There was no showmanship, no attempt to impress. He was simply playing. And it was extraordinary. When the piece ended, there was a moment of complete silence. Then someone started clapping. Soon the entire crowd joined in, the applause echoing through the station. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But the man at the piano did not bow or smile. He simply stood up, nodded once, and walked away. Disappearing into the crowd as if nothing had happened, that was the moment the internet lost its mind. Within days, the video had been viewed over 20 million times. News outlets from around the world picked up the story. Headlines called him the mystery pianist, the homeless virtuoso, the forgotten genius. People made their own reaction videos, watching the footage with tears streaming down their faces. Musicians analyzed his technique, marveling at his precision and control. Everyone had something to say, but no one knew who he was. The comments section exploded with theories. Some people claimed he was a former concert pianist who had fallen on hard times. They said he had once performed in the greatest halls of Europe before tragedy struck, and he lost everything. Others believed he had never received any formal training at all, that his talent was a gift from above, something he was simply born with. A few darker theories suggested he had been locked away somewhere, hidden from the world. His genius suppressed by forces unknown, the speculation grew wilder by the day. People claimed to have seen him in different cities, at different stations, always playing, always disappearing before anyone could speak to him. Some said he was mentally ill and living on the streets. Others said he was a recluse who preferred solitude to fame. A man in Germany swore he had spoken to him once, years ago, in a small cafe in Prague. According to him, the pianist had been a teacher at a prestigious music school before something happened that made him walk away from everything. But when pressed for details, the story fell apart. There were no records, no photographs, no proof. Journalists tried to track him down. They visited the train station where the video was filmed, interviewed the staff, searched through local shelters and homeless camps, but no one could find him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Some people began to wonder if he was even real. Maybe the video had been staged. Maybe it was all an elaborate hoax designed to go viral. But those who had been there that evening swore it was genuine. They remembered the cold air, the sound of the trains, the goosebumps on their skin as the music washed over them. It was real. He was real. As the weeks passed, the story took on a life of its own. The man at the piano became more than just a person. He became a symbol. People projected their own hopes and fears onto him. He was the artist who had been overlooked by a world that did not appreciate beauty. He was the dreamer who had been crushed by circumstances beyond his control. He was proof that genius could exist in the most unexpected places, that talent did not care about money or status or fame. He was everything people wanted to believe in. But beneath all the romanticism, there was a darker question. If this man was truly as gifted as the video suggested, how had he ended up like this? Where had he come from? What had happened to him? And why had no one helped him before? These were the questions that kept people awake at night. They wanted answers. They wanted a story that made sense, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They wanted to believe that someone would find him, rescue him, give him the life he deserved. But the truth, as always, was far more complicated because the man at the piano was not a character in a fairy tale. He was a real person with a real history, a past filled with choices and mistakes and moments that could not be undone. And finding him would mean confronting the gap between the legend people had created and the reality of who he actually was. For now, though, no one knew any of this. All they had was a video, a few minutes of music, and a mystery that refused to be solved. The man at the piano had touched something deep inside millions of people. He had reminded them that beauty could appear in the most unlikely places, that a single moment could change the way you see the world. But he had also left them with a question that would haunt them for months to come. Was the genius real? Or was it all just a beautiful illusion? The search for the truth was only beginning. 3 months after the video went viral, most people had moved on. The internet has a short memory. New stories appear every day, pushing the old ones aside, and the world keeps spinning. But not everyone forgot. Some people could not let go. And one of them was a young filmmaker who had spent her entire career chasing stories that others had abandoned. She was 29 years old and lived in a small apartment filled with notebooks, camera equipment, and stacks of unfinished projects. She had made a few short documentaries before, mostly about forgotten artists and overlooked lives. None of them had brought her fame or fortune. But she kept going because she believed in something. She believed that every person had a story worth telling, and that some of the most important stories were the ones the world had stopped paying attention to. When she first saw the video of the man at the piano, something stirred inside her. She watched it over and over again, studying every detail. The way his fingers moved, the way his eyes stayed closed, the way he walked away without looking back. There was something in that footage that felt different from the usual viral clips. It felt real. It felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. She decided she was going to find him. The first step was figuring out where the video had been filmed. That part was easy. The train station was in a city in the Czech Republic, a place known for its old architecture and winding streets. She booked a flight, packed her camera, and left within a week. She had no plan, no contacts, and no idea what she would find. But she had a feeling. And sometimes, a feeling is enough. When she arrived at the station, she stood in the same spot where the man had played. The public piano was still there, pushed against a wall near the entrance. A teenage girl was sitting at it, tapping out a simple melody while her friends laughed and took photos. The filmmaker watched for a moment, then approached the station staff. She showed them the video on her phone. Had they seen this man? Did they know who he was? Most of them shook their heads. A few remembered the incident vaguely, but no one knew his name or where he had gone. One older security guard scratched his chin and said he had seen the man a few times before. Always late at night, always alone. but he had not seen him since the video went viral. It was a dead end. But the filmmaker was not discouraged. She had expected this. Finding someone who did not want to be found was never going to be easy. Over the next few weeks, she expanded her search. She visited homeless shelters in the city, showing the video to staff and residents. She talked to street musicians, shopkeepers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the man. She put up flyers with a still image from the video, asking for information. She even reached out to online communities dedicated to identifying unknown people in viral videos. Slowly, the tips started coming in. The first real lead came from a woman who ran a small soup kitchen near the old town square. She recognized the man immediately. He had come to the kitchen a few times over the past year, she said. Always quiet, always polite. He never spoke much, but once she had heard him humming a melody while he waited in line. It was beautiful, she remembered. Like nothing she had ever heard, she did not know his name. But she told the filmmaker that he sometimes slept in a park near the river, under a bridge where the city's homeless gathered during the cold months. The filmmaker thanked her and set off. The park was quiet when she arrived. A few pigeons pecked at the ground near a fountain. An old man sat on a bench, feeding them breadcrumbs. She approached him carefully, not wanting to startle him. When she showed him the video, his eyes widened. "I know him," the old man said. "He used to sleep here, but not anymore. He left a long time ago." "Do you know where he went?" she asked. The old man shrugged. "People like us, we do not stay in one place for long. He could be anywhere by now." It was frustrating. Every lead seemed to bring her closer, only to slip away at the last moment. But she kept going. She interviewed more people, collected more fragments of the story, slowly began to piece together a picture of who this man might be. Some of the things she heard were inspiring. A former music teacher claimed that the man had once been his student. Decades ago, at a small conservatory in the countryside, he described him as brilliant but troubled, a young man with extraordinary talent who had struggled to fit into the rigid structure of formal education. According to the teacher, the student had left the conservatory after just 2 years, vanishing without explanation. Other stories were darker. A social worker told the filmmaker about a man matching the description who had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years. He had suffered from severe depression, she said, and had lost contact with his family long ago. She could not confirm if it was the same person, but the timeline fit. Then there were the contradictions. A street musician swore that the man had never studied music at all, that he was entirely... He claimed to have met him years ago in Vienna, where he played piano in underground bars for tips and drinks. According to him, the man had learned everything by ear, picking up pieces from recordings and teaching himself through sheer determination. The filmmaker did not know what to believe. Every person she spoke to seemed to have a different version of the truth. Some of the stories overlapped. Others contradicted each other completely. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces kept changing. She began to wonder if she was chasing a ghost. One evening, she sat alone in her hotel room reviewing the footage she had collected. Hours of interviews, dozens of faces, hundreds of words, but no answers. She was running out of money and running out of time. Her friends back home told her to give up, to come back and work on something else, but she could not let go. There was something about this story that had gotten under her skin. She needed to know the truth. Then, just when she was about to lose hope, she received a message. It came from an elderly woman living in a small village about 2 hours outside the city. She had seen the flyers and recognized the man in the video. She said he had lived in the village for a few months, many years ago, before disappearing again. But more importantly, she said she knew his real name. And she was willing to talk. The filmmaker drove to the village the next morning. It was a quiet place, surrounded by fields and forests. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. The woman was waiting for her at the door of a small cottage, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and curious. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea. While the woman shared what she knew, she said his name was Antonin. He had arrived in the village in the late 1990s, thin and exhausted, with nothing but a small bag and a haunted look in his eyes. No one knew where he had come from or why he had chosen their village. But he was kind and kept to himself, so the locals left him alone. He had no money, so he worked odd jobs to survive. He chopped wood, fixed fences, helped with the harvest. But sometimes, in the evenings, he would walk to the village church and play the old piano that sat in the corner. The villagers would gather outside the windows just to listen. It was the most beautiful music any of them had ever heard. "We thought he was an angel," the woman said, her voice soft with memory. "We did not know where he came from. We did not ask. We just felt blessed to have him among us." But the blessing did not last. After a few months, Antonin left as suddenly as he had arrived. One morning, his room was empty, his belongings gone. No note, no explanation, just silence. The woman had not seen him since, but she had never forgotten him. And when she saw the video, she knew immediately. It was the same man. Older now, worn down by the years, but still playing with the same quiet intensity she remembered. The filmmaker thanked her and drove back to the city, her mind racing. She finally had a name, a starting point. But she also had more questions than ever. Who was Antonin? Where did he come from? And what had happened to him in all those years between the village and the train station? The search was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Finding a name was one thing. Finding the man himself was something else entirely. The filmmaker spent the next several weeks following every thread she could find. She searched public records, hospital databases, and old newspaper archives. She reached out to churches, shelters, and social services across the country. She posted on forums and contacted journalists who had covered stories about missing persons. But Antonin seemed to have no official existence. No birth certificate she could locate. No tax records. No address. It was as if he had spent his entire life slipping through the cracks of society, invisible to the systems that tracked everyone else. She was beginning to lose hope. Again, when a message arrived from an unexpected source, a priest from a small church on the outskirts of a nearby city had seen one of her online posts. He said there was a man living in a room above the church who matched the description. He had been there for almost a year now, helping with small tasks in exchange for shelter. He was quiet and private, the priest said, and rarely spoke about his past. But sometimes, late at night, he played the old piano in the chapel, and the music was unlike anything the priest had ever heard. The filmmaker read the message 3 times before she believed it. Then she grabbed her coat and drove through the night. The church was a modest building, made of gray stone, tucked away on a narrow street lined with bare trees. It was early morning when she arrived, the sky still dark, the air cold and damp. She sat in her car for a long time, watching the windows, her heart pounding in her chest. After all these months of searching, she was finally here, but she did not know what to expect. She did not know if he would talk to her. She did not even know if it was really him. She walked to the door and knocked. The priest answered. He was a kind-looking man in his 60s with gentle eyes and a warm smile. He invited her inside and led her through the chapel to a small staircase at the back. At the top of the stairs was a narrow hallway with a single door at the end. "He does not like visitors," the priest warned. "He may not want to speak with you. Please be patient with him," the filmmaker nodded. She understood. She had spent enough time with people on the margins to know that trust was not given easily. It had to be earned. The priest knocked on the door and called out softly. There was a long pause. Then the door opened, just a crack, and a pair of tired eyes peered through the gap. It was him. The same face from the video, older, thinner, but unmistakable. The filmmaker introduced herself. She explained who she was and why she had come. She told him about the video, about how it had touched millions of people, about how she had spent months trying to find him. She promised she was not there to exploit him or invade his privacy. She just wanted to understand. She wanted to hear his story. For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes searched her face, looking for something. Then, without a word, he closed the door. She stood there in the hallway, her heart sinking. She had come so far. And now, it was over. But then the priest placed a hand on her shoulder. "Give him time," he said. "Come back tomorrow." So she did. And the next day. And the day after that, each time, she knocked on the door and introduced herself again. Each time he listened in silence, then closed the door. She did not push. She did not demand. She simply showed up, day after day, and waited. On the seventh day, something changed. When she knocked, the door opened wider than before. Antonin stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The room was small and sparse. A narrow bed in one corner. A wooden chair by the window. A few books stacked on the floor. On a tiny table sat a cup of cold tea and a half-eaten piece of bread. It was the room of a man who had learned to live with almost nothing. She sat on the chair. He sat on the edge of the bed. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he began to talk. His voice was soft and rough, like a river running over stones. He spoke in fragments at first, as if he had forgotten how to tell a story. But as the minutes passed, the words began to flow more easily. And what he told her was nothing like the legends the internet had created. He was not a fallen prodigy. He had never studied at a famous conservatory. He had never performed in the grand concert halls of Europe. The truth was far simpler, and far more painful. He had been born in a small industrial town in the eastern part of the country. His father worked in a factory. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. They had no money, no connections, no dreams of a better life. They lived in a cramped apartment with thin walls and broken windows. They worked themselves to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. Music was not part of his world. There was no piano in his home, no lessons, no encouragement, but somehow, even as a small child, he was drawn to it. He would stop in the street whenever he heard a melody. He would press his ear against the doors of churches, listening to the organ. He would hum tunes he had never been taught, melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. When he was 8 years old, he discovered a piano in the basement of a community center near his home. It was old and out of tune, with several broken keys, but to him it was the most beautiful thing in the world. He began sneaking in after hours, teaching himself to play by trial and error. He had no books, no teacher, no method. He simply listened and imitated. He played the same notes over and over until they sounded right. He taught himself to read music by studying sheets he found in the trash. For years, this was his secret life. By day, he went to school and helped his parents. By night, he played. He got better. Then he got very good. By the time he was a teenager, he could play pieces that professional musicians struggled with. But he never told anyone. He never performed. He kept his gift hidden, afraid of what might happen if the world discovered it. Then came the hard years. He did not go into detail, but the filmmaker could see the pain in his eyes. He spoke of losing his parents young, of drifting from city to city, working odd jobs, sleeping in shelters and parks. He spoke of a darkness that had followed him most of his life, a weight in his mind that made it hard to get out of bed some days. He had struggled with things he did not fully understand. Depression, anxiety, thoughts that scared him. There were times when he wanted to disappear, times when he almost did, but music always brought him back. No matter how bad things got, he could always find a piano somewhere. In a church, in a train station, in the corner of a bar, and when he played, the darkness lifted, just for a little while. The notes took him somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere beautiful. Music was not a career for him. It was not a path to fame. It was survival. It was the only thing that had kept him alive. He never wanted to be famous. He never asked for the video to be filmed. He did not even know it existed until weeks later, when someone at a shelter showed it to him on their phone. He watched it once, then walked away. He did not want to be a genius. He did not want to be a legend. He just wanted to be left alone. The filmmaker listened without interrupting. She did not take notes. She did not reach for her camera. She just sat there, present, bearing witness to a life that had been lived in the shadows. When he finished speaking, the room was silent. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the small window. She looked at him, this man who had touched millions of hearts without ever trying, and she felt something shift inside her. He was not the story the world had invented. He was not a fallen star or a tragic hero. He was something more real, more human. He was a man who had suffered, who had struggled, who had kept going even when there was no reason to. He had found beauty in the darkest corners of life and held on to it with everything he had. And that, she realized, was the real story, not the legend, not the myth, but the quiet, stubborn courage of a man who refused to let go of the one thing that made him feel alive. She thanked him for sharing his story. She promised she would not publish anything without his permission. She told him she would come back if he allowed it. He nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if he was already somewhere else. As she walked out of the church into the fading light, she knew her journey was not over. She had found the man behind the music, but the world was still waiting for answers. And the question remained, what happens when the truth does not match the legend people want to believe? The filmmaker returned to the church many times over the following months. She came with her camera, but she did not always use it. Sometimes she just sat with Antonin in his small room, drinking tea and listening to him talk. Other times they walked together through the quiet streets around the church, saying little, simply existing in each other's company. Trust had been built slowly, and she was careful not to break it. Eventually, Antonin agreed to let her film. Not for fame, not for money, but because, in his own words, he was tired of the lies. The internet had turned him into something he was not. People had invented stories about his past, about his talent, about his downfall. They had created a legend out of thin air. And he wanted the truth to be known, even if it was less exciting than the myth. The documentary took almost a year to complete. The filmmaker interviewed everyone she had spoken to during her search. The woman from the soup kitchen, the elderly lady from the village, the priest who had given Antonin shelter. She included footage of her own journey, the dead ends and disappointments, the moments of doubt and the flickers of hope. And at the center of it all was Antonin himself, speaking quietly about his life in his own words. She did not try to make him look heroic. She did not dramatize his suffering or exaggerate his talent. She simply let him be who he was. A man with a gift. A man with pain. A man who had survived when the documentary was finally released. The response was immediate and overwhelming. It premiered at a small film festival in Europe, where it received a standing ovation. Critics praised it for its honesty and its restraint. They called it a powerful meditation on art, poverty, and the stories we tell ourselves about genius. Within weeks, it had been picked up by a major streaming platform and released to audiences around the world. Millions of people watched, and millions of people had opinions. For some, the documentary was deeply moving. They were touched by Antonin's humility, by his quiet strength, by the way he had held on to music as a lifeline through decades of hardship. They admired the filmmaker for refusing to sensationalize his story, for treating him with dignity and respect. They said the film made them think differently about the homeless people they passed on the street, about the hidden talents and untold stories that existed all around them. But not everyone felt this way. For others, the documentary was a disappointment. They had fallen in love with the legend of the fallen genius, the romantic tale of a brilliant pianist who had once performed in the greatest concert halls before tragedy struck. They wanted the fairy tale. They wanted the dramatic rise and the heartbreaking fall. And when they learned the truth, that Antonin had never been famous, that he had taught himself in basements and churches, that his life had been one of quiet struggle rather than spectacular collapse, they felt cheated. The comment sections filled with arguments. Some people defended Antonin passionately, insisting that his story was even more inspiring because it was real. Others dismissed him, saying his playing was not as impressive as they had first believed. The viral video had been a fluke, that he was just another homeless man with a sad story. A few accused the filmmaker of manipulation, of shaping the narrative to make Antonin seem more sympathetic than he really was. Music critics joined the debate. Some analyzed his technique in detail, pointing out the flaws in his playing, the missed notes, the inconsistent tempo. They said he was talented, certainly, but not a genius in the traditional sense. He lacked the polish and precision of a formally trained pianist. His style was rough, emotional, unrefined. He would never have succeeded in the competitive world of classical music, they argued. He simply did not have what it took. Others pushed back against this view. They said that technical perfection was not the only measure of artistry. They pointed to the raw emotion in Antonin's playing. The way his music seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, the way it moved people to tears even if it was not flawless. They argued that the critics were missing the point. Music was not about hitting every note correctly. It was about connection. It was about feeling. And by that measure, Antonin was as gifted as anyone who had ever sat at a piano. The debate spread beyond music. People began to ask bigger questions. What did it mean to be a genius? Who got to decide? Why did society celebrate some artists and ignore others? Why did it take a viral video for the world to notice a man who had been playing beautiful music for decades without recognition? Some pointed to the systems that had failed Antonin, the lack of support for people with mental health struggles, the way poverty made it nearly impossible to develop talent without money or connections, the invisible barriers that kept people like him on the margins, no matter how gifted they were. They said his story was not just about music. It was about inequality. It's about the gap between those who were given opportunities and those who were not. Others were less sympathetic. They said Antonin had made his own choices. He could have sought help. He could have tried harder to build a career. He could have reached out instead of disappearing. They blamed him for his own circumstances and dismissed the documentary as a pity story designed to make audiences feel guilty. Through all of this, Antonin said nothing. He did not read the comments. He did not watch the interviews and debates that spread across the internet. He stayed in his small room above the church, living the same quiet life he had always lived. The priest shielded him from the worst of the attention, turning away journalists and curious strangers who showed up hoping to meet the famous pianist. Offers poured in. Record labels wanted to sign him. Concert halls invited him to perform. Television producers asked for interviews. A wealthy businessman even offered to pay for an apartment and a grand piano. Promising to give Antonin the life he deserved, he turned them all down. The filmmaker visited him a few weeks after the documentary was released. She found him sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. He looked tired, she thought. Older than when she had first met him. The weight of the sudden attention seemed to press down on his shoulders. She asked him how he was feeling. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "They do not understand," he said finally. "They think I want what they want. Fame, money, applause. But I never asked for any of it. I just wanted to play." She asked him if he regretted letting her make the documentary. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "The truth is better than the lies. But the truth is heavy. It is hard to carry." She did not know what to say. She had set out to tell his story, to give him a voice, to show the world who he really was. But she had not fully considered what that would mean for him. The world had taken his story and done what it always did. It had turned him into content, into a debate, into something to be consumed and judged and forgotten. He seemed to read her thoughts. "It is not your fault," he said. "You did what you believed was right, and maybe some good will come from it. Maybe someone out there will see the film and feel less alone. Maybe they will understand that talent does not need permission. That beauty can exist anywhere, even in the darkest places." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But for me, nothing has changed. I am still the same man I was before. The music is still the same, and that is enough." Now, she left the church that evening with a heavy heart. She had wanted to help him. She had wanted the world to see his gift and embrace him. But the world did not work that way. People wanted legends, not complicated truths. They wanted heroes they could admire from a distance, not real human beings with messy lives and quiet pain. The documentary had sparked a conversation. It had made people think, but it had also reminded her of something she had always known deep down. The world was not kind to those who did not fit its expectations. It lifted people up and tore them down with equal speed. And in the end, the only thing that mattered was how you lived when no one was watching. Antonin had spent his whole life playing for empty rooms and silent streets. He had never needed an audience. He had never needed validation. He had found something pure and held on to it, no matter what the world threw at him, and perhaps she thought that was the real lesson. Not the debate about genius, not the arguments about technique, but the simple, stubborn act of creating beauty for its own sake. Without expecting anything in return, the world would move on. It always did. New stories would take over. New debates would begin. But somewhere in a small room above a church, a man would sit at a piano and play. Not for fame, not for money, not for anyone but himself. And that, in the end, was enough. The years passed, as they always do. The documentary faded from the headlines. The debates quieted down. New viral videos appeared. New stories captured the public's attention, and the world moved on to the next thing. That is how it works. Fame is like a wave. It rises fast, crashes hard, and then pulls back into the ocean, leaving only traces in the sand. But some things remained. Antonin stayed in his small room above the church. He never accepted the offers that had come flooding in after the documentary. No record deals. No concert tours. No television appearances. He lived the same way he had always lived, quietly and simply, with nothing more than he needed. The priest who had taken him in became like a brother to him. They shared meals together, talked about small things, and sat in comfortable silence when words were not necessary. It was a peaceful life, the kind of life Antonin had been searching for all along. He still played the piano. Every Sunday he would walk down to the chapel and play for the congregation. The music filled the old stone walls and drifted out through the windows into the street. Sometimes passers-by would stop and listen, not knowing who was playing, not caring. They just stood there for a moment, letting the sound wash over them before continuing on their way. That was how Antonin liked it. Anonymous, unnoticed, free. During the week, he played for himself. Late at night, when the church was empty and the world was asleep, he would sit at the piano and let his fingers wander across the keys. He played the pieces he had taught himself as a child. He played melodies he had invented over the years, songs that had no names and would never be recorded. He played for no one but the silence and the shadows. And in those moments, he was truly happy. The filmmaker stayed in touch. She visited him once or twice a year, bringing small gifts and updates about her life. She had moved on to other projects, other stories, but she never forgot him. He was the one that had changed her, she often said. He had taught her what it meant to create without expectation, to find meaning in the work itself rather than in the recognition it might bring. She carried that lesson with her everywhere she went. Their visits were always simple. They would sit in his room or walk through the quiet streets around the church. He would ask about her work, and she would tell him stories about the people she had met, the places she had traveled. He listened with genuine interest, nodding and smiling at the right moments. But he never asked about the outside world beyond her. He had no curiosity about the news, the trends, the noise of modern life. He had found his corner of peace, and he had no desire to leave it. Sometimes she brought her camera and filmed him playing, not for any project, just for herself. She wanted to remember the way his hands moved, the way his eyes closed when he got lost in the music, the way the light fell across his face in the evening. She knew these moments would not last forever. She wanted to hold on to them while she could. As the years went on, Antonin grew older. His hair turned fully white. His hands, once so quick and sure, began to slow. He developed a slight tremor that made the difficult passages harder to play, but he never complained. He simply adapted, choosing simpler pieces, playing more gently, finding beauty in what he could still do rather than mourning what he had lost. The priest noticed the changes too. He worried about Antonin's health, urged him to see a doctor, offered to arrange for better care. But Antonin always refused. He said he had lived long enough. He had seen enough. He was not afraid of what was coming. He just wanted to spend whatever time he had left doing the only thing that had ever made sense to him, playing in the autumn of 2023. The filmmaker received a call from the priest. His voice was heavy, and she knew before he said anything that something was wrong. Antonin had fallen ill. It had happened suddenly, the way these things often do. One day he was fine, and the next he could barely get out of bed. The doctors said there was not much they could do. It was just his time. She drove through the night to reach him. When she arrived at the church, the sun was just beginning to rise. The priest met her at the door, his eyes red and tired. He led her up the narrow staircase to the room where Antonin lay in his small bed. Wrapped in blankets, his face pale but calm, he smiled when he saw her. "You came," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I came," she replied, sitting down beside him. "How are you feeling?" He thought about the question for a moment. "Tired," he said, "but not sad. I have had a good life. A strange life, maybe. But good." She took his hand. It felt thin and fragile, like paper. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only honest response. They sat together for a long time. Outside, birds began to sing. The light grew brighter, filling the room with a soft golden glow. She watched his face, memorizing every line, every shadow. She wanted to remember him exactly as he was in this moment. Peaceful, content, at rest. After a while, he spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," she said. He turned his head slightly to look at her. "Do you think I made a mistake? Not taking the opportunities. Not trying to become something more?" She shook her head without hesitation. "No," she said. "I think you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You stayed true to yourself. You did not let the world change you. That takes more courage than anything else." He smiled, a small, tired smile. "They wanted me to be something I was not," he said. "They wanted a genius, a legend, a story they could tell at parties. But I was never any of those things. I was just a man who found something beautiful and held on to it. That is all." She felt tears building in her eyes but did not let them fall. "That is more than most people ever find," she said. He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window. "The music was always enough," he said. "It saved me. It gave me a reason to keep going when everything else fell apart. I do not need statues or awards or people remembering my name. I just needed the music. And I had it. Every single day, I had it." His eyes closed. For a moment, she thought he had fallen asleep. But then he spoke again, his voice even softer than before. "Will you do something for me?" "Yes," she whispered. "Anything. Play something. On the piano downstairs. I want to hear it one more time." She squeezed his hand gently, then stood and walked down to the chapel. The old piano sat in the corner, just as it always had. She sat on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. She was not a skilled player. She had only learned a few simple pieces over the years. But she played one now, slowly and carefully, filling the empty church with sound. Upstairs, Antonin listened. The notes drifted up through the floorboards, faint but clear. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him away. Back to the community center, where he had first touched a piano. Back to the churches and bars and train stations where he had played for strangers who never knew his name. Back to all the quiet moments when it had just been him and the keys and the endless possibility of sound. He smiled one last time, and then he was gone. The filmmaker played until the end of the piece. When she finished, she sat in the silence for a long moment, her hands still resting on the keys. She did not need to go upstairs to know. She could feel it. The church felt different now, emptier, quieter. She stayed for the funeral. It was a small ceremony, attended only by the priest, a few members of the congregation, and a handful of people who had known Antonin over the years. There were no cameras, no reporters, no crowds, just a simple wooden coffin and a few words spoken in the soft light of the chapel. Afterward, She stood alone in the room where he had lived. His belongings were few. Some clothes, a few books, a worn photograph of a woman she did not recognize, perhaps his mother, and a stack of handwritten pages filled with musical notes. Compositions he had never shared with anyone. She took the pages with her when she left. Months later, she arranged for them to be published. A small collection of piano pieces by an unknown composer. No grand marketing campaign. No celebrity endorsements. Just the music offered quietly to the world. It did not become a bestseller. It did not change the course of musical history. But every now and then, someone would discover it. A student browsing through a music shop. A pianist looking for something new to play. A stranger searching for beauty in an ordinary afternoon. And when they played those pieces, something would stir inside them. A feeling they could not quite name. A sense that the music had come from somewhere deep and true. From a life lived on the margins, from a man who had never asked for anything but the chance to create. That was his legacy. Not fame, not fortune, not a name remembered by millions. Just the music, quiet, honest, and eternal. And for those who listened closely, it was more than enough.